I'll start by introducing myself and the observatory. I'm Adelina Comas Herrera. I'm the director of the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, which is very delighted to host this webinar today. The Global Observatory of Long-Term Care is a platform to facilitate cross-national learning about long-term care, and we use a very wide definition of long-term care, which very much includes also social protection for people with care needs, older people. And we're really, really delighted to be the hosts of the Care and Social Protection Interest Group in Southern Africa, Interest Group, which is led by Elena Moore. And now I'm just going to hand over to you for today's webinar. Thank you, Elena.
Thanks, Adelina. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. It is here anyway. I hope everybody's well, and I'm delighted everyone can be here. Thanks for coming, first of all. Today we are going to look at pensions in Southern Africa and African continent more broadly, and we're going to think about how they vary across the region, and what kind of can explain some of these variations and the histories of how they've come to be, and the shaping of how they are currently. And we have three speakers, I'm delighted to say. We have Dr. Morse Jonathan from University of Connecticut. Jonathan Morse, Dr. Morse, I'm delighted to have you here. Thanks so much for coming. Dr. Morse is going to talk about the legacies of labor repression and pension reform in Malawi. We also have Professor Jeremy Seekings from the University of Cape Town, who's going to be talking about the history and future of pensions in Southern and Eastern Africa. And we have Dr. Poloko Nswarang from the University of Botswana, and working with the Family Caregiving of Older Persons in Southern Africa program. And she'll be talking about the impact of the old age pension in Botswana on the quality of life of older persons in Botswana. So we have the three presentations. Each will be 20 minutes roughly. What I'll say, I also want to advertise our next seminar. That will be on the 27th of September. And there we'll be looking at long-term care and family care specifically in the region, and thinking about the various costs in family care. And there we'll have Dr. Nonzuzo Mobikazi presenting together with Professor Lenora Manderson and Professor Kati Ko, who I think might be here today. So that's on the 27th of September at lunchtime again. That'll be 1 o'clock South African time. And so we obviously have started up this working group, an interest group, with the help of Adelina and the Global Long-Term Observatory of Long-Term Care. And we are delighted that everyone can come today. I'm going to hand over to Jeremy.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so I just really want to talk about the sort of history, parts of the history and the implications for the future of pensions in Africa. Great. So, the standard story about Africa is that in global terms, it's a laggard in terms of social protection for the elderly. Expenditure is low, relatively. Coverage is low. Health coverage, which obviously affects the elderly disproportionately, is also very low. We don't have fantastic data, but the data we have from the ILO and other sources is good enough to conclude those things. So if we look at expenditure, this is ILO data, we can see that expenditure of the elderly is relatively low. It's the bottom row, 2% of GDP. For as best estimate for Africa as a whole, but less than 1% in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? But we can see that actually social protection expenditure is low for pretty much all categories of people. So the pension story is Africa is a laggard, but Africa is generally a laggard when it comes to social protection. Why? Next slide, please. Mm-hmm. So I think it helps us think about, the different ways in which elderly people can be supported in general. And I mean, the first is, and this is clearly dominant in Africa historically and into the present, is that older people are supported by either themselves through continuing participation in subsistence agriculture or by their kin. So under late colonial period and early post-colonial period, governments typically supported what I call agrarian welfare regimes. In other words, they supported poor people in their capacity as peasants, not as workers or as poor people per se. Right. Now, the big problem with this, of course, is that across much of Africa, there's been very extensive de-agrarianization, which is a social as well as an economic phenomenon. Agriculture has become less important for the livelihoods of many poor people, and the social relations or kinship relations that underpinned agrarian society have become much weaker. So that was historically and still today probably the most important form of provision. Right. Second form, which is much more important in the capitalist economies of the global north and across much of Latin America, for example, is to support to people through contributory or employment-related pensions. These have a very long history, including in Africa for civil servants, for military veterans, and then much more widely for formally employed workers. And it could take various forms. Now, of course, the big problem in Africa is that formal employment is quite limited, and so only a small proportion of the population, of the older population, can be supported through contributory schemes, and that's true even in the most formalized economies such as South Africa. Then the third route is non-contributory social pensions, and here the focus is really on the poor. These have their origin in poor relief, introduced in British and other colonies, and in indigenous systems, right? And they have expanded, primarily as a result of the declining capacity of kin and communities to support all older people. So if we think about this in terms of sort of a three-dimensional graph, I'm very hard to draw a three-dimensional graph, right? That countries could move in any one of three directions. They could either prioritize workers, they could prioritize small farmers or peasants, or they could prioritize the poor. Historically, regimes, governments in Africa did something to protect workers, particularly civil servants, soldiers. They did something to support small farmers. They did very little to support the poor, really only through drought. Now that's changed recently. Where we're really at in the last 20 years is sort of in this part of this three-dimensional graph. And the big question is, how much support can governments provide to the poor, particularly the rural poor, through social pensions? So, I mean, we have quite a lot of examples of social pensions across the region, especially in Southern and East Africa. And some of these are very extensive: South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland, Mauritius, and to a lesser extent now Kenya, Zanzibar, only from the age of 70. But there's other cases of where growing numbers of elderly people are supported through programs that are not dedicated pension programs, but are targeted on poor households, particularly so-called labor-constrained households, which include a large proportion of the elderly, and that's the case in Zambia and some other cases. We have a whole wide range of programs with different ages of eligibility, different forms of targeting, and different coverage. If we look at the percentage of the population 60 plus covered, we can see that there's really only Mauritius and Namibia which have really got any universal coverage, and that's because even the universal programs typically are only kicking in from the age of 70 in Kenya, for example, or Lesotho or Zanzibar. So there's really low coverage even amongst 60-year-olds, even in countries where there are dedicated programs. So why do some countries have social pensions and other countries don't? Well, there's a bunch of scholars who've attempted to look at this quantitatively using cross-national data. This is not specifically African data, but global data or global South data, right? And we can see a few clear things fairly clearly. GDP per capita is not a big factor, right? There is basically no relationship between GDP per capita and whether social pensions have been introduced. Donor assistance, perhaps surprisingly, doesn't appear to be relevant. We'll see why in a moment. Demographic structure is only weakly relevant, probably. It's a little bit unclear. Different studies find different effects, but there is probably an effect of aging. If you have more elderly people, you're more likely to introduce a social pension, but it's not entirely clear. Again, democracy might matter. Again, different studies find slightly different pictures, it probably matters. What clearly matters is who colonized you. British colonies have a much, much higher likelihood than former French colonies. So there's clearly something going on there. And we don't know whether this is the influence of sort of a British colonial tradition, or whether it was that British colonies tend to be in different parts of Africa with different local dynamics. And then finally, there do appear to be regional neighborhood effects. In other words, if your neighbors have social pensions, then you're more likely to introduce a social pension. That didn't appear to be an effect up to the 1990s, but since about 2002, it appears to have been a factor. My own work is mostly qualitative, not quantitative, trying to understand case studies. And in the case studies that I've looked at, the really crucial factor is the extent of de-agrarianization. In other words, to what extent are significant numbers of elderly people unable to support themselves through subsistence agriculture, or are unable to be supported by their kin for possibly because of the decline of kinship obligations as much as by the decline of agriculture itself. Now, historically, this was mainly because of drought, but obviously it's become much more pervasive recently. So in many of the countries that I've looked at, Botswana being the clearest example, initially provision was made for the elderly really in times of drought. So when drought happens, you have a variety of policy responses, food for work programs, school feeding programs, and typically some kind of relief for households where there's no working age adults, which are often, of course, therefore households comprising the elderly, right? And over time, this really kind of combined with what you might call a poor law tradition, the British poor law tradition, that there would be some kind of discretionary support for people who were chronically poor and unable to support themselves, who would often be, usually be elderly. And these, over time, these kinds of emergency programs, for the most part, evolved into social pensions, right? They evolved into social pensions when governments recognized that they could not solve problems of poverty amongst older people by supporting agriculture, possibly because there was no land left, or because of the current drought, right? Or because kinship kinship obligations were eroding, and then from the 1980s onwards, often because large numbers of elderly people could not be supported by their children because their children were sick or had died due to AIDS. So huge problems, huge challenges, and political factors, in a sense, facilitated this transition. So I've looked at a number of most of these cases of where social pensions have been introduced, and it's very much the same story can be told in each of these cases. So if we consider the case of South Africa, so South Africa introduced old age pensions, social pensions for its white and coloured elderly in the 1920s, in the late 1920s. And this was clearly affected by British colonial practices. But the context was de-agrarianization amongst white South Africans. White South Africans who hitherto had been able to support themselves on the land could no longer do so, and were urbanizing, and pensions were really introduced to support them. And kinship obligations amongst white South Africans were declining. Now, the South African case reminds us that old age pensions are often introduced for very dodgy reasons. I mean, the government at the time introduced old age pensions because it wanted to ensure a racial income hierarchy. In other words, whites and coloureds, however poor they are, should never be as poor as Black South Africans. So, the South Africa's pension scheme has racist origins. It was somewhat decentralized in the 1940s when the government recognized and employers recognized that there were real problems of poverty in rural areas, and that something had to be done about that. But it was really only in the 1980s and early 1990s it was completely deracialized. The graph there shows the racial discrimination in benefits in South Africa, starting in 1920s when they were introduced for white and colored people, and ending in 1993 when discrimination was finally eliminated. And so in South Africa now, old age pensions enjoy very, very widespread support. This is just some survey data asking samples, representative samples of South Africans, some questions about old age pensions, and you can see that almost everybody agrees that the old age pensions, which are by comparative standards quite generous, should be more generous, and that elderly people do not spend them on their pensions on beer or drinks. So old age pensions in South Africa have become, they've become taken for granted. They enjoy very, very widespread support. Now, what about more recent reforms in Africa? Right. So in general, social protection reforms have resulted from what we might call negotiations between international organizations, including aid donors and national governments, where national governments have often been quite reluctant to introduce new programs. Right. Now, the problem with the pension story is that there is no international organization or aid donor who has really been lobbying powerfully for social pensions. The primary international agency pushing for social pensions has been HelpAge International, which has very limited resources. It's not a UN agency, it's an international NGO network, has very few resources, very little leverage. The big players, the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, the big donors, generally been quite ambivalent about support for social pensions. The World Bank, for example, although it does endorse social pensions as one of its pillars in a multi-pillar approach, really sees investment in children as far more developmental than support for the elderly. So I want to very quickly say something about two cases of more recent reforms, Botswana and South Africa. So Botswana introduced its old age pensions in 1996 without any involvement from international organizations. They're universal pensions paid to everybody above the age eligibility age. The benefit level is very low, which is possibly surprising, given that Botswana has now a GDP per capita higher than South Africa, for example, but the value of the old age pension is less than half of the old age pension in South Africa. The cost was correspondingly low, at about 0.5% of GDP, which is much less than half of the cost of the old age pension program in South Africa. Now, Zanzibar, I think is a very interesting case, because Zanzibar, which is a semi-autonomous territory within Tanzania, has a much, much lower GDP per capita than Botswana. It's not a middle-income country. And in Zanzibar, pensions were proposed by a variety of international organizations, including HelpAge International, right? And eventually pensions were introduced in 2016 with very modest benefit and a very high age of eligibility, but still costing about 0.4, just under 0.5% of GDP, much the same as in Botswana, but of course the GDP is much less. So if we look at where pensions were introduced in these countries' development trajectories, this graph shows GDP per capita over time, and we can see that GDP per capita in Botswana started off very low in independence, but is now right up there, right? And Botswana introduced pensions in 1996, pretty much halfway up its development trajectory, if you like. Now, Zanzibar is much, much poorer than Botswana in terms of GDP per capita. And we can see that Zanzibar introduced old age pensions when its GDP per capita was a fraction, much, much lower than Botswana's was when Botswana introduced old age pensions. So why did Zanzibar introduce old age pensions? Well, it had some things going for it. It had long traditions of poor relief and religious charity, Muslim charity, for the elderly and orphans and so on. There was pressure from outside agencies, and I think it had a really, really effective intervention from the HelpAge International. Now, I see the Zanzibar case as really a textbook case of how low-resourced, poorly resourced international organizations can lobby effectively for reform. HelpAge International did a really amazing job, working very, very carefully with officials in different ministries, building up a coalition that supported reform, right, taking advantage of the fact that the government was facing strong electoral pressure, right, and eventually succeeding in getting old age pensions introduced. Yeah, and that was the Help Age International was very patient. They were very diligent. They did everything right. I think they had a local. They had Kiswahili speaking people on the ground. This wasn't a case of people flying in from Washington or from Geneva, telling them what to do. It was a really, really excellent case of a really effective partnership, if you like, between reformers in an international agency and reformers within the government.
There's one minute left, Jeremy.
Okay, I think I better skip this then. Let's just go on. So this is my last slide, I think. So where does this leave us? Well, we can see that there are some really exogenous pressures in Africa which are going to affect the politics of pensions. The most obvious being rapid population growth, and including rising numbers of elderly people, right? And we can see that de-agrarianization is accelerating across much of Africa. There's rapid urbanization. That we can see that kinship obligations are being eroded in many societies across Africa. There's going to be more and more need, if you like, for elderly people to be supported in ways which they have not been before. But the big question is, are pensions an electoral or political issue, right? The Zanzibari case, it's a case of where an international agency seems to have done everything right, and they did get a pension, fairly parsimonious pension introduced, right? But by and large, pensions do not appear to be a pressing electoral issue or political issue across most of Africa, right? So I can see that there are encouraging signs that if international agencies and local reformers adopt a sensible approach, they can have influence. But I wouldn't expect that Africa is going to cease to be a laggard in these terms in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Seekings, for your detailed presentation, specifically outlining, your long-standing topic on the changes in kinship obligations and the erosion of such. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, during the Q&A. I'm going to move on to the second presenter, Dr. Nswarang from the University of Botswana. She's going to be talking about the impact of the old age pension on the quality of life of older persons in Botswana. Dr. Nswarang is also part of the Family Caregiving of Older Persons program. Go ahead, Poloko. Lovely to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Elena, for giving me the platform. Hello, everyone. I'll be talking about the impact of old age pension on the quality of life of older persons in Botswana. And in the presentation, I'll try to describe the program. I will describe the program, and I'll also highlight on the institutional arrangement, how is the old age pension organized and how is the program distributed within the organization or within organizations or institutions in Botswana. I'll also talk on the eligibility criteria, talk about the eligibility criteria and the impact. Then at the end, I'll talk about the impact on quality of life of older people. As the previous speaker has mentioned, the old age pension in Botswana was established in the 90s. And to be specific, it started in October 1996. And it's a universal coverage scheme. So it usually, covers or is only those who are age 65 years and above are the ones that qualify to access the program or the scheme. The beneficiaries of old age pension currently receive a cash transfer of 830 pula per month. Please note that this amount was just increased the last month. So prior to that, they were getting 530 pula. So that means they got an increase of 300 pula. So the need for old age pension was based on the fact that the government realized that there was a need to provide financial security to the elderly citizens of Botswana. The reasons being that as the country developed, there was dwindling informal social networks and support networks that were available, especially prior to independence. That's where we were seeing that there was a lot of, need informal social networks. But as the country developed into a middle-income country where people had to go to cities and towns for employment, most of the elderly people were left behind in the villages or rural areas without any social support networks. We have also experienced, disintegration of the extended family support system in our country. Also, we can relate that to the new economic structural systems where people have to engage in formal employment, and usually it's away from their home villages. And people nowadays, do not see the need to take care of their extended family members. So it's like more people are now more into the nuclear family kind of support system. So that's why there was a need to consider the needs of the elderly people. Then there is loss of income. Usually when people get old, they lose income due to sickness. As you know, that aging is associated with, with illnesses, with disability and with other chronic health conditions. So in such situations, you find that the elderly people end up, spending more money to get some health, health services. So they end up spending more of their income into such kind of health services. Then we also have the elderly who retire, and then after post-retirement, they experience a lot of different challenges. So they end up sometimes, not being able to have adequate income to take care of themselves. So the old age income pension was established also to support such kind of individuals. The old age pension is distributed by the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. And the specific department that deals with that is the Department of Social Protection. What happens is that the ministry deposits cash transfers into post offices, into banks, and other selected service providers, and that's where the elderly people can go and get their monthly income. At the moment, 97,026 beneficiaries of the scheme usually collect their dues at the post offices. Then 16,234, they usually collect from the Kotla. So you find that these are in areas where we don't find post offices or any banks, especially in the rural areas. So the Kotla is usually used as a focal point where people can come and get their money. So the pension officer will drive to these rural areas to go and pay the beneficiaries. Then 8,460 usually receive their dues through the bank transfers. So if an elderly person has a bank account, they usually have that option to choose to get for their money to be deposited into their bank accounts. Eligibility criteria, as it has mentioned before, it's only those who are aged 65 years and above who can benefit from the scheme. And only Botswana citizens with a valid identity card, we call it Omang, do qualify to get to register for the scheme. So you need to be a Motswana, and that Motswana need to be, emphasized by the identity card or the Omang. So even if you are you are not a Motswana by birth, but you acquired your citizenship through other means. You still qualify because you have an identity card. If you have an identity card, I meant to say. So the scheme is in the form of a social allowance. That means there's no means tested. Even those who are getting other forms of pensions like employees pension or insurance, they also qualify to get the old age pension. But we need to know that those who are serving prison terms or who are on extramural sentence, their payments are usually temporarily suspended until they finish their terms in prison. They are also not entitled to arrears for the period for the period in question or the period when they are in prison. So they do not qualify for any payments. Then the beneficiaries can also appoint a proxy or a person who can collect their income on their behalf if they are not able to do so. As we know that some elderly people usually are very old, and so they are not able to move up and down to go and get these payments from these various institutions. So they usually have the opportunity to indicate the people who can do that on their behalf. Then the arrears for those who are eligible for them can only be claimed within a continuous period of 23 months from the date of application. So arrears beyond 23 months are forfeited. So, but currently, there is a system where, they need to show that they're still there after every 6 months. If, they are not showing up, at least after 6 months, they have to go and indicate that they are still alive so that they can be continued to be kept in the system. In terms of the number of beneficiaries, statistics from 2021 shows that there's out of the total number of those who have registered, 59.1% those who are residing in urban areas, 40% reside in rural areas, and 88.1% in cities and towns. So, and the current statistics by Department of Social Protection shows that 121,720 have registered for this old age pension scheme. So what impact has this old age pension had or have? What does it have? How does it impact the older people in terms of quality of life? This OAP has been beneficial because people can buy food or their daily nutrition needs. They can buy clothes, they can pay for school fees using the money, depending on where their independents go to school. For example, we know that in government schools, usually children are required to pay like development fees, and usually those development fees might range between 100 to 300 kula. So they also have the opportunity to contribute to burial societies and to church events. They are able to purchase or to pay for utilities. They are able to pay toiletries. They are able to even support orphans, because some of these elderly people are caregivers or guardians of orphans or people who have lost or grandchildren who have lost the biological parents. And usually they use this little money to try and support their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. The other The other uses of this OAP includes, a situation where they can save and build houses. Some of them invest in livestock production. And it is also a way in which, they are protected from poverty, and they can also deal with other, it can also pay for other deprivations that they might have. The scheme also helps the elderly people in terms of reducing inequality and social exclusion. You can imagine a situation where an elderly person resides there in a village and they don't have any support. They don't have any kind of financial support or social support from anyone. But with the OAP, we know that at least it bridges that gap between the people who are in need and the people who are not in need. And the fact that they are also, some of them might not have even worked any formal employment or informal employment in their, have had any informal employment in their lives. That means this OAP also gives them an opportunity to also, have that opportunity to earn something or to have some financial income. Then it also, it also increased the life expectancy rate of the elderly population. Remember, as people age, we know that they tend to suffer from many illnesses, injuries, so they get the opportunity to use their money to access health services. If they need to pay for some, either supplements or medicine, they can do that. They can also, support even family members. Because of some limited social networks or social safety networks in some situations, the elderly people can also use their old age pension to support their families. Then the delivery of payment of OAP is also flexible, as beneficiaries have the choice to choose where they get where they can get the money or they get their OAP. And that, gives a sense of, gives them a sense of control and satisfaction, and satisfaction, because they might decide even not to take all the money at a go. So that I think gives them a sense of control. It also, in general, given what they can do with the money, it gives them some dignity. They also feel like they are human, and they're part of their, part of their communities. They can be recognized because of the fact that they can earn some money, and they can even make some input in their families. Despite the benefits that are associated with OAP among the elderly in Botswana, we need to note the challenges that we have. The cash grant of 830 pula is inadequate to cover basic needs, given the rising cost of the rising cost of living and inflation in our country. So 830 pula, it cannot cover everything that they need. And there have been reports of physical abuse of beneficiaries by members of the public and some family members wanting to steal money from the elderly, meaning that it also requires that there has to be measures within the community to ensure that we protect the elderly from these dangers or from these negative impacts that come with the fact that people might know that the elderly are helpless, and it will be easy for them to steal this money from them. Then the age limit of 65 is also not harmonized with the retirement age of 60. So if the retirement age is 60, and then the old age pension scheme says that you can only benefit at the age of 65. For those who are not earning adequate pension to sustain them, that means they are also disadvantaged somehow. Or those who might not even be able to get decent packages from their various employers. That means somehow in the long run, within this 5 years of after retirement, they might, meet or have more challenges outside the work or the employment, and that might also pose further challenges of being unemployed or being an elderly. Then some potential beneficiaries living in remote areas might lack information and access to services. So that means, there's a need also to make sure that there's a need for the government to reach out to people, so that people who live away from resources, to ensure that people are educated more about the package, the old age pension, so that they can have access. For some people, they might even think that if they get employment pension, they might not be eligible for the old age pension. So there's a need of to provide more education to those who might lack knowledge of the scheme. The program does not.
Just 1 minute. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, I'm talking about the last point. The program does not have the results metrics. So that means usually the monitoring and evaluation is not that well, implemented, and there are no impact studies that have been conducted in the country. So that means there's also limitation in terms of research and literature in the area. With that, I thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Nswaring, and thanks for keeping to time. Sorry about that interruption. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. I know I have quite a few questions on that as well. But I'll move to our last speaker, who will speak. Dr. Jonathan Morse, if you're ready to take it away, and Nevada has your slides.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you very much for the past two speakers as well, and to Jeremy too for setting the stage for some of what the pension sector looks like across Africa. Well, great. Again, I'm Jonathan Morse from the University of Connecticut. It's great to be here. It's morning here, but it's great to see everybody. And I'm here to talk a bit more about pensions in Malawi. That's what I've been asked to talk about. And as Jeremy noted, like social pensions, pension policy in general in Africa is a laggard in kind of continental perspective. And kind of to situate Malawi within that sort of environment, Malawi's pension sector is much weaker, much smaller than even the average pension sector in sub-Saharan Africa. And kind of to assess that, is that just a matter of material conditions? And what I argue is that it's not just a matter of material conditions, it's not just a matter of GDP per capita. And instead, part of my research looks into countries like Malawi and assesses the role of deeper historical legacies and how they influence contemporary pension policy, and in particular, state labor relationships and the importance of labor unions for pension policy, but also something that Jeremy had hinted about the role of democracy in this kind of the politics of pension expansion or pension politics, is the role of elite democratic politics, kind of getting a little deeper into democracy and how that shapes Malawi's pension sector. And so part of what I'll talk about today has a lot to do with formal sector pensions in Malawi. And if I have time, I can also talk about some of the efforts to expand pensions beyond the very, very small formal sector in Malawi. I just want to mention, this is part of, I'm a political scientist, so this is part of a broader kind of research project that I've been involved in for the past few years that assesses variation in social protection across a lot of contemporary Africa. It looks pretty much more exclusively in depth at 3 countries, at Ghana, Senegal, and Malawi. It's been the past 5 years where I've done a lot of field work, a lot of archival research, and for what I'm going to talk about here in Malawi, a lot of elite level interviews with political elites, with key figures in the social protection sector, including people in the Reserve Bank of Malawi, which I'll mention, that oversees a lot of pension policy in Malawi, the Employer Association, the trade unions, and some of the civil society organizations. The main one for older persons in Malawi is called MANEPO, the Malawi Network of Older Persons Organization. And part of this project too, and I'm going to present a little bit of this data as well, is an extensive data set, trying to get better descriptive data. As anybody working in this sector knows, it's difficult to get good data. It's difficult to get historical data on the landscape of social welfare in Africa. And I have a data set that kind of covers the independence to 2022 period. So I might be repeating some of what Jeremy said here, just to give kind of a bit more of the kind of continental picture, but kind of hone in a bit more on the different aspects of pension policy that Jeremy talked about. So on the left here is sort of the structure of formal sector pensions in Africa that generally benefited civil servants at first and then kind of expanded to people employed in formal waged employment, people who received a paycheck, which was generally a very small proportion of the population, anywhere from 5 to 15% of the population. But the mechanisms by which formal sector workers have been protected differs a lot. For the most part, this corresponds a lot with colonialism. The former French colonies adopted some form of social insurance or a defined benefit system where you contribute to a national social security fund. And then when you came to retirement age, you got a benefit that was proportional to what your average wage was when you were employed. While the British colonies, for the most part, adopted the Provident Fund model, which was you contribute to a national savings account, basically. It's a defined contribution, but not a defined benefit. And then you get a return on that investment depending on how well the government invested that money. And then other British colonies, also some of them did not offer, and Malawi is one of them, any protection for formal sector workers in pension schemes, or put it completely on the private market with some sort of mandatory individual or privatized account. And one of the stories that has really kind of changed over time is that provident funds have kind of fallen out of fashion, and social insurance has gained traction in some of the former British colonies. The only countries that I believe still have provident funds are Uganda and Eswatini. So there's this movement, which is sort of puzzling to some people who thought that, you know, since the 1990s, this would be an era of massive privatization and individualization of formal sector pensions. Is actually the trend in Africa has been towards more socialized insurance through defined benefit systems. But there's another kind of contrary trend there at the bottom, and Malawi is one of them as well too, where there has been some movement towards, again, individual or private accounts. Another story is, you know, as far as the value of these pensions are, and this is very difficult to calculate, especially when you're comparing different pension systems. We generally look at what's called the wage replacement rate. Is French colonies or non-British colonies tended to be a lot more generous than British colonies. But there's been increases in generosity. There was a period of stagnation pretty much in the 1980s to the early 1990s. There's still a bit of a gap between British and non-British colonies, but the wage replacement rate has increased. Of course, that doesn't mean that these pensions are very valuable, because it's, again, if wages are very low, the wage replacement is not going to do much for you. And it doesn't mean that these pension systems necessarily pay these pensions consistently or on time and there's not issues with them. But that's one of these notable trends, is they've actually become more generous over time, and this movement towards socialized insurance. And this also echoing what kind of Jeremy said, is that since the early 2000s, with a number of changes across the continent, some economic stabilization, changes in sort of international aid policy, maybe the return of democracy to parts of Africa, is there's been more experimentation with pension expansion. It doesn't cover a lot of countries, so some countries have non-contributory pensions. Other countries have what I call old age social assistance, cash transfer programs that either incidentally or deliberately target the elderly. And there's actually been some experimentation with what are called informal sector contributory pensions, sort of flexible designs to allow people, sort of market workers, cocoa farmers, cashew farmers, certain sectors of the informal economy, to create voluntary, for the most part, pensions. Now, in that sector of non-contributory pensions, lots of variation in how generous they are. One way you can measure this is how does the value of the monthly pension measure up against the poverty line. South Africa, Seychelles, Mauritius stand out for more generous pensions compared to Botswana and even Namibia. But some of the more recent kind of entrants into social pensions, Kenya, Eswatini, they're very low value pensions. And in some of these cases, again, the eligibility is very high, 70 and above for some of these pensions. So where does Malawi fit into some of this? In Malawi, the 2011 Reform Act established Malawi's first mandatory pension system. And this is the central piece of legislation that still structures a lot of the pension sector in Malawi. It's limited. It's limited to employers with 5 or more employees. So based on some data, about 5% of the labor force contributes, and the program covers about 2% of the elderly population, so not very many. The way it works is there is a national pension fund, but most people contribute to privately managed individual accounts. So it's a defined contribution system. People pay in, and based on how well the bank or whatever investment or pension fund invests your money, that's what you're going to get back when you get retirement. The oversight of the entire pension sector in Malawi is governed by the Reserve Bank of Malawi, not by a Department of Social Welfare, not by a National Social Security Institute, which didn't exist in Malawi, but by the Reserve Bank of Malawi. It's a 5-10 contribution rate, so employees put in 5%, employers put in 10%, which is pretty average for the continent. One notable feature about the Malawi pension system is this was part of the negotiation. The retirement age is very low in Malawi because life expectancy was so low when this bill was negotiated. So the retirement age is 50. And another unique feature of it is that it has this life insurance component to it, that you have to basically pay the value of 1 year of pension as life insurance. In the pension sector in Malawi, there is also a social cash transfer that covers about 15% of the elderly with a small stipend. It was established in 2007, but really only expanded in 2012. The value of it is about $9 a month, which is low for cash transfers. About 14% of household consumptions versus the standard in Africa for these type of cash transfer systems to cover about 20% of household consumption. It's very difficult to assess because it is incidentally targeting the elderly, so it's very difficult to calculate how many elderly are actually covered by the social cash transfer. And just last year, they re-triggered the targeting mechanism of the cash transfer. And so the new entrants are about 10 years younger now. And so there are actually fewer elderly people enrolled in the new form of targeting in the cash transfer program. So that number actually might be declining now over time. Now, universal pensions or social pensions, there were failed attempts. Not really attempts, but really kind of promises that entered kind of the political mainstream between about 2018 and 2020, a lot to do with the 2019-2020 election in Malawi. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about more of that later. So in comparison, one thing I can do is I can look at kind of what is the main mechanism by which a pension is delivered in Africa. Is it universal? Is it through some form of social insurance or individual or privatized account? What's the coverage of the main kind of official pension programs? And if you have something for the formal sector, what's kind of the average replacement rate? It's just a way of kind of showing what the balance of coverage versus protection for the formal sector is. And Malawi, again, stands out where it's a very weak protection for formal workers and very low coverage in general. There's no universal pension. Everything's individualized and privatized. So it stands out as one of the weaker pension systems or pension sectors on the continent. So, to assess this, like what explains it? Why is Malawi so low? And Jeremy's mentioned this, like GDP per capita is not a great explanation. Now, Malawi is a very poor country, the poorest country in Southern Africa. Yeah, on its own, low levels of poverty haven't precluded social pensions in other places, including in Southern Africa. Jeremy mentioned Zanzibar. I'd also mention Sierra Leone that has a small social pension. That's not a universal pension, but it's kind of a means test, smaller scale pension. So not necessarily sort of a hinder, even though Malawi stands out as very poor compared to other countries. It is true, though, that Malawi is much more agrarian than the average country, the highest in Southern Africa, and its formal sector is very, very small. And that's an important structural condition, but not one that I think is necessarily constant, but one that was actually shaped and molded by politics. If we look at the level of democracy, if I look at a measure of the varieties of democracy, it's a sort of a global enterprise that measures democracy for better or worse. It gives Malawi a score on average over the past couple decades of about 0.51, which is above the continental average, and it's pretty much on par for Southern Africa. And so while elections are imperfect in Malawi, there have been multiple turnovers of power. There's been some consistency, not perfect, in political actors and political parties, although also a lot of fluidity. If we look at kind of international actors and globalization, kind of Malawi is very trade dependent, which might expose it to kind of the forces of globalization and put pressures on its pension system to provide minimal benefits. But Malawi doesn't really stand out in this sense compared to the average country. It is also true, though, that Malawi is much more aid dependent than the average country in Africa, which you might think that maybe these kind of international transnational networks have kind of more influence of either selling ideas, imposing ideas in some cases. But then you would expect, again, more progress along social pensions in Malawi than there actually is. So my argument focuses on two things, on kind of historical legacies. And in Malawi, what really matters for the first part is kind of British colonialism, or what British colonialism made for a place like Malawi. British colonialism is often used as a factor to explain a lot of variation in pensions and social welfare and protection in general, but it actually manifests very differently from country to country. But also looking at post-independence strategies of economic development, of ideology of the post-independence leaders, and how that had an influence on the pension sector. And then a second part of what my kind of project does is look at these kind of elite level commitments, is when are there electoral incentives to deliver policies like social pensions that are public, usually non-discretionary, versus a style of politics that bases more on coalition making amongst rival elites, kind of buying political support either at the elite level or sometimes buying political support at the local level through clientelism or vote buying. And also how parties relate to each other. And this I'm actually cribbing off of some of Jeremy's old work here, is that when do parties brand themselves in certain ways versus when do they kind of mutually emulate each other and try to outbid each other on the same thing? And I'll show if I have time, like in Malawi, parties tend to brand rather than mutually emulate each other. So in Malawi, a couple things to important, like British heritage and approach to social welfare, is that, British colonialism, the general overview we have of the feeling about the impacts of British colonialism is that it translates into more conservative viewpoints about the role of the state in providing social welfare. In Malawi, this conservatism was elevated to some degree because the colony was not seen as a major economic powerhouse, Nyasaland. It was mainly seen as a labor reserve colony where you can find cheap labor, but not to work in what became Malawi, but actually to work in neighboring countries. And so one of the facts about British colonialism is that compared to other British colonies, rates of urbanization were much lower. That at independence, only about 4% of the population was urbanized. And the labor organization was much weaker to begin with. Returning workers who came from Zambia, who came from other colonies back to Malawi, did not really effectively organize into an effective labor movement. One of the major economic policies within Malawi of British colonialism was to elevate basically estate-based agriculture, tobacco and tea estates for the most part. And one of the results is that Malawi became independent with comparatively lower levels of social protection than the average British colony. There was no official pension system in Malawi at independence, not even for civil servants, which was sort of a concession that civil servants gain in other countries. And the labor union was very small and very weak. Now, when Hastings Bandas became president of Malawi after colonialism, his style of leadership, his ideological orientation, was not to counter those trends of British colonialism, but actually to lean into them. He infamously had very antagonistic relations with what became was the NTUC, the Nyasaland Trade Union Organization. This is a quote that I found from the archives from one of the parliamentary debates where they're talking about pension systems specifically, where he talks about there will be no pampering here. This is what I mean by no welfare state, no pampering, I repeat. And so he had a very antagonistic approach towards labor. In 1964, there was what's called the cabinet crisis in Malawi, this big political turmoil, and that kind of antagonistic relationship actually turned into outright repression. The civil service unions were banned, although they actually did receive a pension. One of the concessions he's made, we're going to ban civil service unions, but we're going to provide a non-contributory pension to civil servants. A new kind of umbrella organization was created, a government-sponsored trade union organization called the TCUM. The teachers' union was outright banned for over a decade. And union activity was basically defunct for many, many decades. And concurrently, Banda really continued the economic strategy of the British that really based a lot on estate-based agriculture. And that opened the door in Malawi also for a strong role for private insurance providers. The major ones were Old Mutual Insurance and Nico General Insurance. And it's estimated, it's hard to get good data though, that maybe about 30% of private firms were actually voluntarily providing a pension through one of these private insurers. So that private sector wasn't doing, it wasn't mandatory, wasn't doing a good job at protecting any formal service sector workers. And the regulatory environment was very, very fragmented. It's not clear what laws kind of governed the pension sector during this period. So pretty much a period of labor repression and very weak pension provision for people outside of the civil service. So when I tie that in my conversations in Malawi, when I come back and I say, okay, so then Hastings Banda is removed from power in 1994. He loses the election. In 1995, a new trade union kind of umbrella organization is created called the MCTU, the Malawian Congress of Trade Unions. It's sort of an age of revival for trade unions. And I go and talk to them, how did they approach these negotiations that happened in 2011 over this kind of pension bill? And one of the kind of, how you can link some of these legacies of oppression to the pension sector specifically, is that one of the first notable things was that pension policy was just simply not a priority for formal sector workers. Their main priority was to restore bargaining rights and wages. And in fact, the impetus for the Pension Act in 2011 didn't come from labor. It wasn't labor coming, hey, we need to reform the pension sector. We're weakly protected. This private scheme is not working. It actually came from employers who felt they were kind of being double taxed at the time because they were providing severance and some of them were providing pensions. And so this sparked kind of a prolonged kind of legal back and forth between employers and the state, eventually leading to the creation of kind of a working group and a committee in 2010 to work on pension policy. It's also very clear from my conversation with people in the MCTU is that they were not prepared for these negotiations with government. They didn't have the sufficient policy expertise. They didn't have also the mechanisms to solicit input from their members. Major partners like the teachers union said we were informed but not consulted about the process. And all the labor leaders I talked to admitted that they had not studied pension reform experience in other countries. They were unfamiliar with the range of options they could negotiate on. The topic of social insurance or a defined benefit was never really broached. Their main concern was the retirement age, which is what the government conceded to, and to create what's a flexible savings account, which the government didn't agree with, but they just didn't come prepared with any policy experience to the negotiating table. It's also clear, though, that the government itself didn't have a lot of expertise in government and contributor pensions, and really deferred a lot to the private insurers who were part of this negotiation process. And there was a big cognition that it's really difficult to create kind of new institutions, to create like a new social security institution or a national social security fund, that we had to use the existing infrastructure and landscape of institutions in Malawi to provide pensions. And this was evidence from parliamentary debates and from actors who purposefully, some of them said, we avoided talking about a national provident fund or a national social security fund because we knew there would be government resistance. Next slide, please.
Dr. Morse, there's 2 minutes left.
Okay.
I can see you're on slide 12. Wow.
Yes,
Thanks.
so here are some of the kind of the quotes from some of the members that were there. We were essentially led by the pension fund managers. You'll find the skews towards the market because the government didn't understand pensions. We forced ourselves into the current system. And these legacies had a big influence on the choice to adopt an individualized and private kind of formal sector pension, but also in the implementation of the bill, because the Reserve Bank of Malawi basically didn't have the capacity to manage this new scheme. So it took a long time to begin to get compliance. There was no cooperation with the Ministry of Labor until 2018. To date, there's still no centralized pension database in Malawi. The expansion has increased from about 150,000 workers to about 500,000 contributors today. And last year, they had to pass a reform bill that kind of tried to expand mandatory coverage, that gave additional oversight power to the Reserve Bank of Malawi. But it's been a very, very steep learning curve in Malawi, which is also why it's lagged a lot. Next slide, please. How much time do I have? I might have time, but I can talk about this more in the Q&A. Like
Sure.
The other side of this was these ideas about universal pensions that really began around 2016 when the Ministry of Gender commissioned a feasibility study from Help Age that basically kind of followed what they had found in other African countries, that GDP per capita is not necessarily a hindrance. Basically, you change the parameters of a universal social pensions to match the country. And the idea was that for Malawi, you could get something kind of what you have in Zanzibar, Kenya, a limited age 70 above. And this was incorporated as official policy in the national policy for older persons. And then that really received a lot of political support in 2018 and 2020 when a political candidate who was part of the ruling party defected to create his own party, the UTM, and he made social pensions a campaign pledge. It was the first time that a political party in Malawi had done that. And in 2018, here's a copy of the motion. John Chikilamba, who since passed away from the People's Party, introduced a members' motion in Parliament to create a universal pension that passed. It didn't make it legislation. It basically showed that members, at least theoretically, kind of supported the idea of a universal pension in Parliament, at least. And this was to actually beyond the parameters of the study, was going to be for 65 and above. but that failed to launch. Well, a number of reasons why it didn't launch. First of all, again, another kind of legacy in some ways of labor repression, or kind of these legacy, other historical legacies, is that the centrality of the agrarian sector, that farmers, subsistence farmers, was such an important political constituency in Malawi, meant there was strong prioritization of other policies rather than direct social assistance like cash transfers and universal pensions. And Malawi, the prioritization was for agricultural subsidies. And so it kind of ties into what Jeremy was talking about, these kind of balances of this three-dimensional graph that he showed, is that Malawi, there's definitely leaning into, this is a strongly agricultural society, and things like a universal pension just don't make sense for us. There's also strong incentives for elite level patronage to form willing coalitions. Every government in Malawi has been a coalitional government, and parties have really tried to brand rather than mutually emulate. And so when the UTM and Salus Chilima promised this social pension in 2018, no other party picked up on the theme. It just became the UTM's idea. And here are some quotes, from some of the advisors to the president at the time, is that pensions aren't going to bring you more votes. It's desirable, it's important, but it's not going to do anything for you. And even from people in civil society, presidential candidates look at pension schemes as something that there's no kickback. There's no way to kind of skim any money off of it, really, to kind of finance political coalitions. And one thing that happened is that when Salus Chilima later, he's now the vice president of Malawi, and when he joined government after the 2020 election, the social pension pledge that he made pretty much fell off the political agenda. And when I talk to people in his orbit in Malawi, they talk about, well, there's no way that the current government, which is the MCP party, could adopt his idea. That's his idea. We can't make it our idea. That would be contrary to how politics works in Malawi. And so just to conclude, like perhaps unsurprisingly, organized labor matters for pension policy. I think that often gets overlooked in some discussions of pensions in Africa. Historical legacies can influence the political salience of policy areas like pensions, but also the appropriateness of specific models like universal pensions. One of the ironies about Malawi, and I think this is one of the questions in the chat, is one of the reasons I think that there was such a robust discussion about social pensions, even though it didn't launch, was because there were such weak protections for formal sector workers. There was no established model of contributory insurance to build on. And that, the kind of the specific structure of democracy, like even under similar degrees of democracy, can shape the incentives to kind of campaign on social welfare and these type of things. I think that, again, is much time to talk about today, but I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Dr. Moss. That's really insightful, and I really appreciate the time and detail in taking us through that. I'm going to open up for questions from everyone. I've seen there's one in the chat, and I know that you addressed it slightly. Deborah, I think you raised it, and she's asking whether the labor move. There's Deborah. Go ahead, Deborah.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's just been answered quite comprehensively in the last last paper. But I just wondered if Jeremy had anything to add about that, because Jeremy, fascinating papers, all three. So thank you very, very much to everybody. But Jeremy, I wondered if you had anything to add about labour movements more widely, as it were, or even in the South African context.
I mean, I think Jonathan's exactly right. Across most of Africa, trade unions have been very weak because the formal employment is so limited. And there is some variation, and South Africa is clearly a case of where trade unions are have a lot more political power and influence than in most other countries. But in South Africa, and I think generally, trade unions have often struggled, to balance, if you like, their sectional interests, their very particularistic interests with broader concerns. So, in most of Africa, trade unions organize non-poor people. I mean, if you have formal employment, you're not poor, right? So means-tested old age pensions are rarely the priority of union members, right? Now there is a caveat to that, which was relevant in the South African case, which is that trade unions have been quite keen on some welfare reforms because they want to reduce trade union members' responsibility for poorer kin, right? So even if trade union members are never going to be eligible for means-tested social pensions, they might have dependents who are, and therefore they have an indirect incentive to lobby for old age pensions. right? But that said, I mean, I think it's, you know, across most of the continent, trade unions have prioritized their members' interests first, and that has generally meant organizing around contributory pension schemes. Jonathan didn't talk very much about something which I think is seriously understudied, which is the very specific provisions for civil servants, and for that matter, the military. I mean, Africa has a very long history of pensions for senior civil servants and the military. And we generally don't take that into account because it's not really, you know, it doesn't reach beyond those very, very specific occupations. But you know, by and large, they've been interested in their own interests rather than anyone else's. So I don't, you know, even in a South African case, the trade union movement, which, you know, presents itself as being very progressive ideologically, has always been quite ambivalent in practice about what it's going to do for welfare reform for non-members.
Thanks, Jeremy. Other questions? Tugazita, hi, go ahead.
Hi, fantastic presentations. And I suppose I have a little bit of a curveball because I know we're looking at pensions, but I'm wondering about kind of broader social protection reform. And so when we're talking about a universal basic income grant that could cover everyone from 0 to 100, has there been any conversation about this, or do we still want to see it categorized as child support grant, you know, children's support versus a UBIG of some kind versus an old age pension?
Yeah, I mean that there is a politics around basic income grants in South Africa, and there have been experiments in Kenya and in Namibia. But I think it's fairly safe to say that by and large, governments and ruling parties are extremely. So I've got a dog trying to butt in here. He's a puppy. That governments and ruling parties are very ambivalent about basic income, and the reason they're very ambivalent about basic income is because there's a very widespread antipathy towards giving working age adults something for nothing, and I think, you know, there's a very strong normative concern about that. So I think there's much more sympathy amongst ruling parties and governments over social pensions and grants for children than there are grants for working age adults. Mm-hmm. So the politics of pensions is different. And the politics of children, social grants for children, is different again. I mean, there you have powerful international organizations lobbying for reform, most obviously the World Bank. And the World Bank is prepared to put in quite substantial financial resources, as well as its ideas, backing support for children. UNICEF obviously is a powerful player. It doesn't have so much money, but it wields quite a lot of influence in other ways, right? So you know that, and there, you know, there is very, very extensive coverage of school feeding schemes, growing coverage of child grants. The politics of that is very different. Pensioners are sort of second in the queue, really, I suppose, behind children in terms of deservingness. Right? They're a long way ahead of working age adults. So, I mean, I think that you know, we're going to see pensions being expanded long before we have basic income really on the agenda properly.
Dolly, I see your hand. I'm going to move on to Dolly for another question, and I maybe when you get it, the other speakers can respond to that point as well. Go ahead, Dolly. Great to have you here, Prof.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for the presentations, all of you. And thank you so much, Poloko, for representing us so well. I was coming here for this presentation on my way to my office, and I was listening very attentively to parliamentarian debates. Our parliament is on right now, and old age pension was actually, you know, amongst the issues that were debated. And interestingly, the opposition party, you know, are saying that they really are concerned about the fact that our old age pension is so low. And they were actually proposing that it should be doubled to at least 1.5, because indeed it is very low. Because most of the time you find that within the household, the old age pension supports other members of the family. And so, but it was very interesting to hear the response from the current government parliamentarians, who were arguing that the elderly in the households have other social protection benefits, and therefore they felt that the provision currently is more or less, to say it is adequate, that our children have like free education, there's free healthcare, there are other social protection benefits like the destitute program, there are other, I think the current government is now introducing other agricultural reforms, and so forth. And therefore the argument was that we have to look at everything in totality. And obviously, being in the program of family caregiving and doing the study, we are really finding that on the ground, our older persons are really going through hard times. And obviously we will share with you more, what we've been studying. But these are very, very interesting debates, and I'm glad that at least at that level, our parliamentarians are having those debates. Thank you.
Thanks, Dolly. And good timing to listen to the radio. We should have tuned into that discussion, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's a question directed directly at anyone specifically or a direct question. I mean, maybe I'll tag on to that. This question around, perceived ideas around double dipping or what's been called double dipping, or for example, in Namibia, we were given the runaround when we started looking for the eligibility criteria for drought relief. And whether, whilst it is geographically based, drought relief being targeted at a particular district suffering more proportionately from drought, etc., they weren't able to tell us whether older person households were a particular target within particular areas. And so there was quite a lot of confusion and not just a lack of willingness to give a response to the idea that older persons will be targeted, obviously for old pensions, but for other things as well, as members of households, not just as individuals. And so this idea of, getting targeted at a household level and an individual level, and the ways in which that causes tensions with receiving multiple grants or programs. And I'm wondering whether that has featured in other parts of the continent in the same ways that I've seen it now in particularly in Namibia and in Botswana, as well as Dolly alluded to there. So maybe, I don't know, any of the speakers can respond to that.
I can just say something that kind of echoes what Arabian had mentioned, because about sort of conservative leadership, right? And this not wanting to give out things to undeserving people. And I think this idea of double dipping, but I would just say that conservatism is not distributed evenly across Africa. A place like Malawi is more conservative than the average. And so when the social protection kind of sector began to emerge in the mid-2000s, it was a clear conversation and pushback actually against donors to create very specific categories of eligibility. Extreme poor labor constrained could get these type of benefits. Extreme poor labor active, they would have to go public works. Certain other, so that is more unique actually in British colonies than in French colonies, these questions of kind of who deserves what. There's still, I think, sort of a French legacy still in the former French colonies of universalism and deservedness. So that's part of that conservatism. But again, it's not distributed evenly. Malawi stands out, I think, from polls of leaders as more conservative in that way than the average. So a lot more fear of that kind of double dipping. Now today, like there's a big question of you have people on agricultural subsidies, which is a massive, the most expensive social protection program in Malawi is agricultural subsidies, whether they should also be on cash transfers at the same time and who's eligible for what. So that's definitely entered the debate. But again, not really in pensions because there is no pension besides the social cash transfer that incidentally hits the elderly.
Yeah. Poloko, Jeremy, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
So I mean, just in response to Jonathan, I mean, I've always who's knows much more about francophone pension systems than I do. I've always thought that the sort of Francophone universalism was a bit of a pseudo-universalism. It's a sort of like the historical universalism of the ILO. All workers are eligible for programs, right, on paper, but they have to be workers, and in practice, informally employed workers never get close to being anywhere near a program for the most part. But you're right. I mean, there is a sort of a much more of a universal sort of norm in the sort of French colonial tradition, which isn't there in the same way in the British colonial tradition. On the double dipping, I mean, this is a question which I hope Poloko or Dolly can address. I mean, because double dipping is a huge issue in Botswana. The government and government officials are really preoccupied with so-called double dipping, and my understanding is that really drove the government's willingness to work with the World Bank on preparing a single social registry. And the World Bank seems to think that a registry is going to enable the government to roll out support for people who are being erroneously omitted hitherto. The government seems to think that a single registry is the purpose of it is to stop people claiming benefits that they shouldn't be claiming. Quite the opposite of the World Bank. But my sense is that double dipping, and this is really maybe Poloko or Dolly can say something about this, is that the government thinks about it much more in terms of individuals than of households. Right? In other words, individuals shouldn't be claiming together or serially different support from different programs. There's not so much a concern that households are in a sense eligible for multiple programs, and that's if that's the case, that's a bit surprising given that there is such a strong familial norm or ideology in most things that the government or the BDP in Botswana do. I don't know if Dolly and Poloko can comment on that. Is double dipping an individual phenomenon or a household phenomenon?
Poloko?
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Okay. I think, as I've mentioned in the presentation, is that there is limited research on issues concerning the elderly. And as we have mentioned, the elderly have to take care sometimes of family support in even the destitute policy or destitute program is not even enough, given the economic status or the inflation rate and the expenses of living at the moment. So I think the problem is that I think the government sometimes often makes some decisions without prior research on issues. So of course we can say that it can be double dipping for people who are any, let's say, decent employment pensions, but the situation on the ground, as Professor Nzan Odoli has mentioned, is that if you go out there and do some research, you find that even elderly people who have children who are working decent jobs, they are not even taking care of them. So I think we need to, there is the need for the government to strengthen research in the area of, social protection and social security, so that they can fully understand the needs of people in the community, or who are the needs of the elderly people. So I think, I think that's my own opinion about, double dipping. I cannot say that people are doing double dipping, whereas the destitute policy itself is not even adequate. Even if you can combine it with the old age pension scheme, for some families, is still not adequate.
Thanks, Poloko. I know Adelina's looking at me, telling me time's up, and I know we have hit the 2:30 mark. I do have personally one or two more questions, but I can direct them separately thereafter to the speakers. I don't know if anyone else in the room, first of all, has questions. I don't see any other hands up, or maybe I've missed something in the chat. I don't think I have. And so what I will do, you know, we haven't really talked about a human rights agenda here and how it links, but I'm not gonna raise it. I will hold off and I will speak to people separately. I want to thank all the speakers for their time and their inputs and their preparation and for sharing their ideas and their work with us. It's been really informative. I really appreciate it. I think everyone here does. I'm sure you're willing to also share your slides or your readings further, and that would be great. Thanks, Adelina, again for facilitating this with us. As I mentioned, on the 27th of September, we have our next seminar for the Global Observatory Long-Term Care Special Interest Group with Dr. Mbokazi, Professor Ko, and Professor Manderson talking about more on the cost of family caregiving, of actually family care. So we look forward to that. Thanks again to the three speakers, and I hope you all have a nice afternoon.